Life can be extremely unpredictable. For example, you could grow up in a comfortable neighborhood and have good friends and financial security and pretty much anything you could hope for, and then one day a wizard and a bunch of dwarves show up on your doorstep and drag you off on a grand adventure where you find a magic ring, almost get roasted by a dragon, and by the time you get back home, you're a completely changed person through and through. Now that's another story entirely, but it does serve to point out how life can take a curious turn you never would have expected, and that is the story I have for you today. It is the story of a young man who grew up to be a classically trained and accomplished painter, back in the days when being an artist was a viable way to procure food and shelter, and he rubbed shoulders with the movers and shakers of the era, and life was good until a deep personal tragedy sent his head and his heart into years of painful solace and regret, until a chance encounter years later gave him a new lease on life and a new mission. And that mission ultimately transformed the entire world, the echoes of which continue to reverberate today. Samuel Finley Breese Morse was born just outside of Boston in 1791. His father was a Calvinist pastor and a supporter of the Federalist Party. Now, young Samuel grew up in the way that children tend to do and went to school in Andover, Massachusetts, and from there he went on to Yale College in Connecticut, where he studied many different subjects and, like a young real-life Harry Potter, he excelled. While at Yale, he supported himself through painting, and by the time he graduated from Yale, with honors, he had caught the eye of Washington Allston, an accomplished painter and poet. Now, with the help of Samuel's father, Washington planned out a 3-year program for Samuel to study art in England, because the famous Dutch masters had all died off more than a century earlier, and the French painters of the time were busy getting all gothed up and grotesque. It was in England that Samuel grew as an artist and was accepted into the Royal Academy, which would have been impressive for anyone, but was especially impressive for a young man from the colonies. While at the Royal Academy, his skill and his reputation continued to grow. However, while Samuel was studying in England, war erupted once again between Britain and her former colonies in America. And after the American victory at the Battle of New Orleans, which technically occurred after the war was officially over, Samuel completed his studies in England and returned to the United States, where he made a comfortable living as a painter. Now, his commissions included the former presidents John Adams and James Monroe, as well as the Marquis de Lafayette and many social and political elites. He moved in some pretty impressive circles at the time, even if he was not one of the famous luminaries himself. In 1818, the young and accomplished painter married the love of his life, Lucretia Pickering Walker. The young couple had a happy life and settled near where his father lived in Connecticut. They started a family, and while Samuel traveled up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States to support the family as a painter, Lucretia stayed home and raised their growing family. In 1825, Samuel was working on a commission in Washington, D.C. when a letter was delivered to him by messenger. It was a letter from his father to tell him that Samuel's third child had been born, but that Lucretia had fallen ill, and his father urged Samuel to return home immediately. Even as Samuel rushed to pack and hurry home, a second letter arrived from his father to bring the sad news that Lucretia had died of a heart attack. Samuel was inconsolable. What's worse is that the news had taken 4 days to reach him, and by that time the love of his life had already been buried. It was a tragic blow for the young man. Samuel continued to be a successful painter, but there was a hole in his heart that could never be filled, and the slow communications options of the day had stolen from him the opportunity to properly say goodbye. Now, it's widely believed that 7 years later, on a fine day in 1832, Samuel was on a ship returning to the United States from Europe, and he had a chance encounter with Charles Taylor Jackson of Boston. Now, Charles was a scientist that was primarily interested in geology, chemistry, and medicine, and while he has an interesting and colorful story, he had done some work with electromagnets, and it was this work that he demonstrated for Samuel, and it sparked something deep inside the still grieving artist. Now, Samuel had always wondered, what if there had been a more efficient or even nearly instantaneous way of communicating over vast distances? And with the demonstration of electromagnets, Samuel had an idea about how to possibly create a simple but highly effective telegraphy system using electricity. So, Samuel abandoned his painting and focused solely on electric telegraphy. Now, back in university, Samuel had been a bit of a Renaissance man, and in addition to art, literature, mathematics, and all the usual subjects, he had studied a fair bit of science. And by the time he saw Charles' magnets, he had already heard a bit about some of the earliest forms of telegraphy. Some used light, while others used electricity, but required many wires for each letter of the alphabet. Now, all of them were overly complicated and suffered numerous disadvantages that prevented widespread adoption. And with this spark of the divine, Samuel thought that maybe, just maybe, he could do a bit better. Samuel began working on a design for an electric telegraph that used just a single wire instead of all that mucking about with reflected light, or running a zillion wires across miles of open country. With the help of clever and resourceful Alfred Vail, they refined the hardware by 1835, and by 1838 they had devised a specialized code that could easily handle messages in almost any language based on the Latin script. Now, while both men had worked on the system, the code became known as Morse code, and presumably Alfred veiled his disappointment. Now, Samuel applied for a patent for the entire system in 1840, and after some refinements and additional patents, Samuel was able to somehow convince Congress to fund the first operational telegraph line, which ran between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland in 1844. Now, this was doubly impressive because the line was a resounding success, and this paved the way for rapid and nearly global adoption of the technology. And the fact that he had convinced Congress on anything and got them to actually do something was nothing short of miraculous. Alfred continued to work with Samuel and within the telegraph industry for several years before bowing out to pursue other pursuits. And his considerable contributions to the technology were eventually lost and forgotten to all except the most dedicated historical scholars. Before Samuel's telegraph, it had taken weeks and sometimes even months to get mail from one coast to another via ship, and it could take over 20 days to send it overland via stagecoach. The newly established Pony Express reduced the time down to just 10 days, but Samuel's telegraph reduced the time to mere minutes, and without running the risk of contracting malaria or getting bit by a rattlesnake. By 1853, only one state east of the Mississippi, Florida, was not connected by telegraph. Telegraph lines soon crossed the American continent, and by 1866, the transatlantic cable connected America and Europe. With the successful installation of telegraph cables across the Atlantic Ocean, messages could be sent from the west coast of the United States to Eastern Europe in minutes, where sea voyages via steamship between Britain and the United States still took 8 or 9 days. Though ordering takeout delivered directly to your door was still rather disappointingly over a century into the future. The adoption of Samuel's telegraph meant that for the first time in history, communication was no longer limited to the speed at which a physical message could pass between locations. Contemporaries said Morse had obliterated time and space. Military leaders could now flash orders to distant battlefields in near real time. Business people could collude on prices and control monopolies on opposite sides of the globe within mere minutes. Journalists responded to growing demand for timely news by forming the Associated Press, an international news organization that continues to operate today. And shortly after genuine journalism went international, tabloid journalism was born and spread even faster. By the time Samuel died in 1872, he was wealthy and celebrated. His invention literally reached around the world and almost to every corner of the globe, with telegraphic cables stretching across Eurasia, the Bering Strait, North America, and the Atlantic Ocean. The former painter who failed to receive a tragic personal message in a timely manner and couldn't say goodbye to his wife ended up giving the entire world the ability to say anything to anyone instantly. Thank you for watching. Cheers.